Welcome to Magic Academy podcast. Today's guest is Christy Tucker. I'm so excited that she is on the show today because she has been specializing in scenario-based design for over 20 years. And especially when we're looking to the future where everybody's wearing a Vision Pro, going into the virtual environment to learn, the scenario-based learning would be especially interesting and exciting how we can learn that in virtual environment and then apply that in the actual environment, the workspace. We talk about what is branching scenario, case studies of great branching scenario design, what are some potential challenges, how would virtual realities, VR, XR, blockchain, AI impact branching design. So let's enjoy. Hello, Christy. Welcome to Magic Academy podcast.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me on.
Our pleasure. Let's do an intro. How would you introduce yourself?
So I think my career has always been about helping people learn in one way or another. I started out teaching K-12 music and band. So I taught 5-year-olds all the way through 18-year-olds. When I left teaching, I switched to corporate training and I found out that I really like working with adult learners. I did a lot of going to different businesses and teaching people how to use Microsoft Office and Project and Access and relational database design and doing a bunch of those different things. And got my first instructional design job at an online university in 2004. And I have been working in online or hybrid learning ever since 2004. So next year it'll be 20 years of doing this. I started my own business. Yeah, it's a long time. It is a good stretch now that I've been doing this. I started my own business in 2011. And so that's Skillsthat Learning is the company name. But most people know me through my blog, which is Experiencing E-Learning. And because I've been blogging since 2006, and so I've been just writing and sharing, and a lot of what I do is just sharing that expertise or sharing as I'm working out loud and as I'm figuring things out that I posted on the blog for other people to see and to share that expertise.
So what is scenario-based design? What is branching?
So I think in instructional design, we always are a little fluid with our terminology. So a branching scenario is a scenario where you have a situation where the learner has choices to make, and depending on what choices you make, you see different consequences and the story continues in a different direction. And you will see different things depending on what choices you make. So there is, I think, a broader scenario-based learning. I think I would count under scenario-based learning. I do, for example, one-question mini scenarios in a lot of my training. Or there are some things that are more linear scenario structures where, yes, you have some decisions, but you're always going to be on the same path kind of regardless of what you do. That are more linear or constrained structure. That aren't necessarily true branching scenarios. A branching scenario is something is going to end up with multiple paths and multiple endings. So there's sort of that broad umbrella of scenario-based learning, and within that, the one type that I especially focus on is the branching scenario.
Very interesting. So I would assume that scenario-based, especially branching scenarios, are excellent training mechanisms for critical thinking and decision making in a complex situation.
If you're teaching a procedural skill where you can basically have a checklist and it's going to look the same every time you do the skill, you should probably use a different strategy instead of branching scenarios. There are easier ways to do it. Maybe it is a simulation of some sort, but effectively you still should just have a linear path because the process itself is linear. Branching scenarios are great for the tasks where there are potentially multiple ways to do it right, or there are different ways to get there. For example, if you're teaching a skill that is how to fill out a timesheet for an employer, that is a procedure you probably do want to simulate that environment. You might even have a mini scenario that is, oh, you actually needed to take off on, you were gone on Tuesday afternoon is for an emergency and you need to correct your timesheet. How do you do that? That is still a scenario. I would put that under the umbrella of scenario-based learning. But you don't need to have multiple endings and multiple paths and shades of gray and nuance on that, right? It is pretty straightforward. You should do it one way and it should go in a particular way. Simulated conversations are really common for branching scenarios because, of course, anytime you're talking to two, you have a conversation between two people, there's different ways that could go depending, and what you say affects what the other person will say back to you. So that particular training was something where we were training doctors on how to address alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder with their patients. So this was part of a larger training where we had we had some direct instruction. I had some mini scenarios for different pieces of it. We looked at different ways to screen for substance use disorders and the different models and the research and why it's important and drugs to treat it and different things. But one of the key skills that they really wanted to teach was what's called a brief intervention. And it essentially was like a 5-minute conversation with a patient, but structured in a way, there was research about how to do this as a quick conversation between a doctor and a patient that increases the chances that that patient will be motivated to change their behavior. It starts out, you've done the screening for, here's this 22-year-old college student. He's got, this is the scoring for his screening. You've got this. He's also got gastritis, which is problems with his stomach, his digestive system, that you're concerned is exacerbated by his alcohol use. And so now you're going to have the conversation. So what's the first what's the first thing that you say? And then you have 3 choices. And if you start that conversation out with something really judgmental, that is, your drinking's really a problem and you've got to make a change right away. Starting out judgmental, the patient gets angry, and shuts down and is not motivated. But if you choose a choice that says, as your doctor, I'm really concerned about how your alcohol might be making your gastritis worse. Can we talk about that some more? Then you're opening it up to a dialogue. You're approaching it as your expert, about the doctor approaching it with concern. In training, sometimes about desirable difficulty. Of the idea of desirable difficulty is that sometimes having things hard is actually good for learning, because we want things to be hard enough that people are really thinking. When we piloted this, the doctors all failed the scenario the first time. Like, every one of them failed it when they did it. Especially, they were practicing it in isolation and without the rest of the training. They all got it wrong. Every one of them got to a failure point. None of them got it perfect on the first try.
They probably started with a judgment.
Right? Because, and it is one of those things that, like, doctors are often good at doing diagnosis and not necessarily good at having diplomatic conversations with patients. Like, this was a skill, and this particularly was a skill that they knew that the doctors needed extra practice on, and that this was going to be one of the challenging things. And so, yes, when we did the pilot, they all failed the first time. Many of them failed more than once, and I actually had to go back and make some tweaks on it, provide some more feedback to give them a little bit more hints of you jumped to you jumped to making a goal without assessing his readiness to change first. Maybe you want to try that. And having more opportunities for people to correct mistakes. Because of course in real life, if you would make a mistake, if you would kind of skip a step in a process, you would probably like try to go back and do that. And in most of the time in a conversation, you can probably get by with it. Sometimes it did end up at endings, such as the like judgmental of, one of the choices at one point is that they talk about how he's going out drinking with his friends every Friday and Saturday night. And the doctor says, well, you just need to find better friends. And like there's not actually an opportunity to correct your mistake after that. Like that one was a scenario ending choice. If you make multiple wrong decisions in a row, it can screw it up. But so it was a really interesting project, and we did get to, do the pilot with actual learners. And to put it out there as part of that project. And so I think it was really good. It did definitely show me some of these problems of having a scenario kind of grow out of control and be more of a problem for development and for reviews than I had quite realized. I didn't quite realize what I was getting myself into. And I'm much better at planning these things and managing it now than I was at the time. But I think it's still a project that I'm proud of, and I think it's held up because it was the choices in it, even though the multimedia of it was built in an old version of Captivate, and the multimedia of it looks a little dated, but the text of it, the choices were all really good. It was the decisions that they needed to make. I had plausible errors that were tempting for people to pick, as evidenced by the fact that the doctors picked not necessarily those worst choices all the times, but I had something that was maybe partially correct or the right step at the wrong time, and so you did the steps out of order. And so they had to really know it, and almost all of them ended up going through the scenario multiple times, and so they ended up getting multiple iterations of that practice to get more practice with that skill.
That gets me interested. So as of now, if somebody come and say, "Hey, Christy, let's do a branching scenarios to help develop inclusive leadership for our team, specifically implicit biases." How would you go about it? Do you think branching scenario is the solution?
So I think that, it is always the case of, branching scenarios are a great thing. There is nothing that's the right strategy for every situation. Implicit biases in particular is a really tricky one. And I think diversity, DEI, DEIB training is tricky with branching scenarios because often in a branching scenario, you're saying it's, for example, you are in this situation, what do? You're doing everything in second person. Even if you're putting things in third person and having it be controlling a character, what should Sophie do in this situation? It is problematic to have people practice biased behaviors in a scenario, right? That is right. Do you want to put somebody in the situation and have them say the transphobic thing, have them dead name their coworker, have them make a racist remark, right? Like that's not the way to use a branching scenario. There is there had been a study that had been done about helping people retrain habits for implicit biases, where like if you'd learn to recognize when you had a stereotypical thought and then acknowledge it and then think about some sort of counter stereotypical example. So there is some training on that. In general, however, for most diversity training, I think that that's kind of like advanced, not generally what most of us are going to be doing. For most people for diversity training, you are better off looking for what are the specific behaviors that we want people to do. So, for example, I worked with an organization that was working on improving their diversity, especially around gender diversity, that they had found some pretty big disparities. So I was working with an organization. We did focus groups. We'd talked to people and found out two of the big areas where they were having trouble was recruitment in the first place and in retention. And so essentially getting people in the door in the first place and then keeping them once they were there. When we did our focus groups, we found out some people who were having success in the organization and found out what strategies they were using within the context of this particular organization so that we could teach specific behaviors. And so rather than focusing on the bias, we did talk about the bias, and that was part of the training, but I wouldn't use a scenario for the bias part of it. We used the scenarios for, here's the recruitment strategy, you're working with this other person and they've planned this other recruitment strategy. What do you think and what feedback would you be given? Right? Like, figure out how you're going to do your recruitment strategy to manage so that you are encouraging a more diverse population to join in the first place. And then we had some scenarios related to the retention part of it, on how do you keep people there and what are the ways that you make sure that everybody feels heard and feels valued and has that belonging. Again, those are behaviors that you can look at and measure. And one of the tricks with branching scenarios is both figuring out very specifically what the behavior is that you want people to be practicing and making that behavior narrow enough that you can really do it in a branching scenario. Right? Like that simulated conversation that I had that was really a 5-minute conversation, but ended up being like a really huge branching scenario with 15 different endings. If you don't narrow down the topic, it's so easy for things to get out of control. You are better off narrowing the topic to a very clear, we're looking at recruitment strategies. We're looking at how do you look at data for pay equity within your organization? How do you look at those retention strategies? Or the one other thing that I do think works well for branching scenarios is bystander training, which is essentially if you hear someone make an anti-Semitic or Islamophobic comment, how do you respond? If someone says something, how do you respond? How do you de-escalate a situation? How do you help someone who is being victimized? So it is where you are neither in the position of being the person who is racist or sexist or bigoted, nor are you in the position of being the victim in the scenario. You are a third party. So it gives you some separation. It can still have a lot of emotion, but it tends not to be the traumatizing thing that, frankly, being either the victim or the person doing bad things can be. You have some separation, and it is a real skill, because there's plenty of people who would say like to be allies, but aren't quite sure what to say when their coworker makes a homophobic joke. And so you can practice those skills so that then if you've practiced it in this simulated conversation, you have some ideas of, you've seen some things to say, and then you get into that situation where, my coworker said this thing, and so now I can say, oh, well, what do you mean by that? And you have that line kind of ready to go. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, can you explain that joke? Because almost always if you ask people to explain a terrible joke, they will realize how terrible it is. And so that's, one of those techniques for doing it. So you can teach those techniques because those are behaviors.
What are some other common challenges in scenario branching?
So I think with branching scenarios, there's always a challenge of how complicated the structure gets. And I think that there are ways to address that, but I have definitely had some of that, complex structure. One of the other things that has been a problem often is getting through the review cycles with subject matter experts and stakeholders, because often when I'm doing this with organizations, it's the first time they've ever done something nonlinear. They are not used to reviewing content that isn't linear. Teaching people how to do that, or teaching people how to, frankly, you have to kind of train your reviewers how to do those reviews.
Mm.
And so you do have to have a process in place. Over the years, I've refined that more. I've got instructions that I can give reviewers to say, okay, I want you to go through the prototype first. For one thing, I get a prototype out earlier in the process, and that does help that review. But review the prototype, and then I give people a screenshot of the structure, because some of the subject matter experts always like to follow along and see what the structure is. And then I will give them usually a text export so that they can edit it. And even with that, like wrote a script for an interactive video for a client. And so there were bad responses and okay responses and good responses. And I had everything tagged as to which one it was. And on one of the bad responses, the feedback from the SME was, no, you would never say it this way. This is the wrong way to do it. You should say this instead. Like, good, I'm glad we agree that's the wrong way to do it. That's what we're supposed to, that's what we're supposed to be demonstrating here. And she still kind of did not quite understand it. Even having done all of those things. And so getting through the reviews and getting feedback, and then doing revisions if it turns out that I've really messed up and I need to make significant changes to the structure. That also can be challenging, but that review process is one that is always that it can go really well, and it can take a really long time to get through.
Yeah, it feels like you have to kind of condense your decades of experience and kind of give them a crash course, not only like training people, but also like train the trainers like in a very short period of time. And yeah, that is quite challenging.
It is.
Do you think scenario or like branching scenario based learning can be more effective in general compared to traditional training? Do this type of training actually reduce training time, increase learning retention at all?
Yeah. The closer we can get the practice to look like the work environment, to look like the kind of decisions that people need to make in their work, the easier it's going to be for them to transfer work to the workplace. Ruth Clark, in her book on scenario-based e-learning, talks about research where she talks about where scenario-based e-learning can accelerate expertise, is the phrase she uses. And essentially, she talked about a case study where they were working with automotive technicians and had found that the automotive technicians needed to do like 100 different tickets to have learned how to do all of the troubleshooting things and to get to competence within a particular area. And so if they did on-the-job training, it took them 200 hours to get to that level of competence. If they did instructor-led training, they could cut that in half. When she was able to do scenario-based e-learning and do simulations and have all of the scenarios that maybe don't come up as often, but that you really do need to know how to do, but you might wait 3 months to get it on the job, that she could get it between 33 and 66 hours. So much of our training doesn't really have people practice the skills. We tell them things, and then we ask them questions about whether they understand it, but we don't really have them apply it. And branching scenarios are a way of making people apply it and making people think about what they're doing and think about well, in this situation, how would I apply this? So even if you're doing traditional direct instruction of like, here's the procedure, here's steps 1 through 5, here's how you do these, open-ended questions, here's how you use this testing to troubleshoot this thing on the car. Doing it in combination with the branching scenarios and practicing it can increase that transfer to the workplace and increase the behavior change, increase the odds that people are going to actually change their behavior when they get into the workplace.
So it's a kind of like a condensed dose of intensive training that will take reality many years to catch up, and you just condense all those scenarios in like one simulation and have them to go over and over and over until they get it right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Now let's talk about AI.
Okay.
I've noticed that you've written a collection of blog articles on your experiment using AI to come up with scenario-based learning, coming up with also like a branching scenarios and all that.
Mhm.
Can you give us a crash course of how was the result?
The Chat GPT and Claude and Bard and all of these other tools. I think that they are great at helping you come up with scenario ideas in the first place. That's often the place, people often get stuck at like you're looking at a blank page and you don't know where to go. I think all of these tools are great for getting you past that blank page and get things started. I think using it as a brainstorming partner is really effective. On my blog, as I was doing this prototype, I was trying to push the limits of how much can I have Chat GPT write this and not write this myself. And so I used the AI, to write more of it than I would in a real project. I think the limitation I found was that it did start sounding repetitive after a while. And even though it did work best when you had lots of back and forth. And I think that that's true of all of these chatbot tools, that they work well. If you start out, you get a response, you refine it, you go back and forth. That even if you go in and use my exact prompts that I used and I put on my blog, you're not necessarily going to get quite the results, because part of the process of going back and forth and refining is what trains the AI to respond better to you. So I think using it as that help that way is good. It does get repetitive after a while. I think it doesn't write as well as an expert writer can write. But the brainstorming, and I also think that using it to come up with plausible alternative choices is also really helpful, because that also is one of the things where people get stuck in writing branching scenarios, right? You know what the right answer is supposed to be, but what are the wrong answers? And you can use the generative AI to say, okay, in this situation, the right answer is going to be this. Give me 3 choices. But I think more often it's going to be that you do little pieces back and forth. That's what I did in my conflict management, where I had it, that the prototype that I had on my blog. And it lists a bunch of like, what's good principles for this, conflict management, and mediating a discussion. So then I was able to tell it, okay, do a wrong answer that breaks one of the principles that you gave me earlier. And so it can refer to itself, and you can train it based on your principles. Or you can, if you don't have those principles, or you don't have that good list of mistakes, you can have it try to come up with things. You're still going to need to check it. You are still going to need to have a SME verified, especially for more specialized content. But getting the first draft done and having it get you unstuck for those alternate choices is, I think, a really smart way to speed up your process for the branching scenarios while still maintaining control over it and not having the AI do all of it for you.
Having AI as a kind of a brainstorm partner, speed tracking the development process, do you think there could be a risk that the AI will dictate or direct where things go, um, will us lose some sort of um, genuine or insightful ideas by kind of saying, "Oh, come up with some ideas for me."
There's a risk of losing some human element. I mean, part of the advantage of the branching scenarios, especially simulated conversations, is that you should have a human element with it.
Mm.
And admittedly, I think sometimes, especially the newer tools, do a pretty good job writing dialogue too. I mean, that is one of the things that you can tell it, and with some prompts and some tweaking, you can get it to do dialogue and doing personality and having some voices with it, or to help you refine your own writing. I think that there's potentially ways to do that.
Mm.
But there's always a risk that it's going to be inaccurate information.
Mhm.
And a lot of the, ChatGPT content often sort of sounds the same. There is a risk overall with generative AI that everything sort of squishes to the middle. Like everything sort of sounds all the same and it loses its personality. And that
Mm.
is a risk with it. So I think that looking at ways that you still, as the human being behind the screen, are controlling it, and you're using it to help you in certain areas where you're stuck. You're using it for brainstorming, you're using it to help with choices, but you're still tweaking it and revising it and having some common sense. Generative AI is like an overeager intern. It really wants to help you, and it wants to help you so much that it will help you and give you something even when it's wrong and it has no idea what it's doing.
Mm.
And so you have to think of it as an intern who you can definitely have help you, but you've got to check its work.
I love this. I love this analogy. I think it's definitely something that it's good to hear. It's good to hear
Yes.
that everybody has to just put that on top of their mind whenever they're using ChatGPT. If there's like a learning development leader, like chief learning officer or learning develop operators, managers, what do they need to know in terms of branching scenarios?
So I think for the leaders who are trying to think about their overall strategy, is you can look at those branching scenarios and look at them in terms of doing small ones and picking those key strategic skills that are trickier, that require more practice, and but that have some nuance, that are strategic, that are risky to practice on the job. Those are the things where you're going to be looking for the opportunities where a branching scenario might be part of your solution. Often in combination with other things. Don't think that by committing to a branching scenario, you're committing to doing a 45-minute long serious game with all of the bells and whistles. A text-based scenario that has really good choices and thoughtful writing is probably going to get you almost as much result as something that's really complex multimedia, because it's about the thinking. And so if you're, as a leader, you're looking for those skills where people need that practice with the critical thinking and decision making. And this is
Mm.
where you can use that technique and add it on top of what you're already doing.
Mm. Mm. I'm curious, like when you were 12, 11 years old, what did Kirsty enjoy doing back then? What was that like?
So when I was 12, I was definitely a band geek. I played French horn in band, and so I did summer band camp. I played in a local marching band, and so we marched parades all summer in black polyester in 105-degree heat. And um, I am still friends with some of those marching band friends that I met when I was 12 and in that community marching band. Um, I did do a lot of reading. As I had mentioned earlier, of reading the fantasy I've always done a fair amount of writing too, but reading and band were the two things that I was really enjoying at that point.
Mm. Music and stories. Mm. What is
Yeah.
Christie's magic?
I think my magic often is that taking those complex topics and making it concrete, making it understandable for people. And that frankly is a thing that I have always done. And it was a thing that I in that whole time that I was unemployed and I was looking for work and in that challenging period of my life, it was also that thing of I really wanted to still help people learn. I wanted to be doing something related to the training and the education, even though it was not quite either one of those jobs that I wanted to still be doing that. And so I think that it is always that my superpower is often that talking to the experts and getting the stuff out of their heads in ways that other people can understand it. I did a workshop earlier this year, and 4 different people. It was a small workshop, and I had 4 different people in that first week saying, "Oh, like here's a thing that I've built just based on this workshop that you did in this last week." And that was such good feedback for me that I gave it to people in that concrete way that they could go apply it right away and they could go do something and build a branching scenario, or at least the start of a branching scenario. And out of the 25 people who were in that workshop, 4 of them had something to show for it within a week that they'd posted on LinkedIn and were sharing about how excited they were that they built a thing with this. And that is magic to me, of being able to see people be successful doing things because I've explained it or trained it or given them the practice opportunities in ways that they act.
Empowering through simplicity.
Yes.
Good to hear. Is there anything else you wanted to share with our audience?
I will just plug my blog a little bit. That you can look for me. It's christytuckerlearning.com. And so I have lots of information about branching scenarios, and I will continue sharing some things about AI as I am learning and sharing as I go along. And so if you're interested in learning more about it, that's where to find more.
Excellent.